Let's continue. I'm very happy to introduce Professor Jeremy Gunn to you. Professor Gunn is a long-standing friend of this summer school. Has been to, I think, all previous editions of the summer school before NETHATE usurped the summer school. Jeremy is Professor of Law and Political Science at the International University of Rabat in Morocco. He also had various other academic appointments before that. He also has been a freedom of religion or belief officer at various commissions. So I note here the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, where he was the director of research. Well, I won't read his entire extensive CV. Let's just be very clear that he's an expert on international religious freedom issues, but also First Amendment, U.S. Law and religion issues, also notably one of the biggest experts on religious freedom before the European Court of Human Rights. In our correspondence, we completely overplayed our hands with Jeremy, asking him for a zillion of topics, and he wrote back, "Well, how can I possibly cramp that into one into one session?" So we very happily narrowed it down to the case study that you are about to get. And I've just noted that in terms of the program, I think we're very gradually shifting, you may note, from religion as a source of, say, protection on the international standards to religion as a cause of concern. Well, that's maybe putting it in the wrong terms. I should say, in the name of religion, human rights violations might be caused. The term Jeremy here uses is the instrumentalization of religion in one particular context, one particular case study that no doubt will be extremely fascinating, also very relevant to many of our research projects in its NETHATE project and beyond. Jeremy, the floor is all.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to come to Ireland. In my past experience, every time I have come, I have brought good weather with me. So it's sunshiny. I remember one year when students came in the morning, the Irish students, they were all white, and after lunch, when they went out in the sun, they all came back and they were all pink. Yesterday, when I flew up from Morocco, it was sunny in Morocco, sunny in Spain, sunny in France, sunny in Britain, and then I saw clouds hanging over the top of Ireland, so I did not succeed this time. So my apologies for that particular problem. What I want to do today is to talk a little bit about the issue of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So we're all familiar with that. On February 24th, my mother's birthday, Vladimir Putin decided to invade and attempt to seize all of Ukraine. He did that with the support of the Russian Orthodox Church, particularly Patriarch Kirill. So what I want to do is try and give some structural background or some thematic background to try to understand the justification for the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. I want to start out, however, so that's where we're going, but I want to start out, however, with a different issue, looking at two other famous religious figures in the United States from the 1980s and 1990s. One of them is Pat Robertson, who was probably the most prominent Pentecostal Christian in the United States. He had a television broadcasting network. And the other one that we'll be seeing is Jerry Falwell, who is perhaps the most famous Baptist in the United States at the time, fundamentalist Baptist. So they had television programs, each of them separately. Shortly after the attacks on the United States on September 11th, Falwell and Robertson jointly had a brief appearance together on television. I'd like to show you that and listen carefully to what they're saying. It's just about 3 minutes long, I think.
Before, I'm sure.
The worst results. And I fear, as Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, said yesterday, on the beginning, and with biological warfare available to these monsters, the Husseins, the Bin Ladens, the Arafats, what we saw on Tuesday, as terrible as it could be, minuscule if in fact God continues to lift the curtain and allow the enemies of America to give us probably what we deserve.
I think we've just seen the antechamber to see what they can do to a major population.
And I know I'll hear from them for this, but throwing God, or successfully with the help of the federal, throwing God out of the public square, out of the schools. The abortionists have got to bear some burden for this, because God will not be mocked. And when we destroy 40 million little innocent babies, we make God mad. I really believe that the pagans and the abortionists and the feminists and the gays and the lesbians who are actively trying to make that an alternative lifestyle, the ACLU, People for the American Way, all of them who try to secularize America, I point the finger in their face and say, you helped this happen.
I totally concur.
So those were two of the most prominent religious figures in the United States. Probably, I don't know who's interfering with this. This is a little scary.
How do I do that?
Okay. So now I don't know what to say or what to do. Okay, so these two people are looking at the attacks of September 11th, when approximately 2,000, we can say innocent people, I don't know what they were doing in their private lives, but they were not warriors, they were not soldiers, they were not involved in any invasions, they were killed. And we have two people coming on television saying, this is what God allowed to happen. And why did God allow this to happen? It wasn't because the United States has an aggressive foreign policy in the Middle East. This is not because people were angry or that these were religious fanatics. None of those. It is some of the domestic concerns of the United States. Gays, lesbians, abortionists, feminists, the ACLU is the American Civil Liberties Union, the largest civil rights, civil liberties organization in the United States and perhaps in the world. I thought after they said that, I need to go work for the ACLU, which I then did, but it wasn't the plan at that particular time. So we're taking this terrible event that happens and we're putting this in terms of a religious context. And we are saying that the reasons that this happened was because of things that we might think of as being entirely separate. So social policies that might be involved. So we are taking now, and they are taking the situation and targeting people inside the United States that they say will be responsible for this. So I want you to think about this. We're going to come back to this issue a little bit later when we look at Patriarch Kirill. I want to start out, however, with first from the perspective of a professor. The time that is allotted is always too short. There's not quite enough time. So I'm going to go a little bit quickly, which I apologize for. I know that from the perspective of the audience or the students, the time is too long. So this is an hour and a half. I don't know that I can support this. The other one is, how do I get this into an hour and a half? So this may be a little bit quick. I want to start out with what this will be my point number one, or Roman numeral one on my outline, some concepts and terminology. So how do we talk about religion, what religion is, and the relationship between religion and politics? So I'm going to start out with a story. This is something that happened to me in the 1990s. When I was working in Washington, D.C., I was contacted by the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and they said they wanted to do a study on the relationship between religious asylum claims and how judges were making decisions on religious asylum. So I had backgrounds on religion and law, and I was asked to write a report for this. So I did a draft report for the High Commissioner's office, and I sent it to them. And they wrote back to me afterwards. They had offered to pay me for this, which is always nice in academia. It doesn't always happen. So I did the first draft of this report, and they wrote back to me and said, well, thank you very much, but there's no definition of religion in your paper. So I thought, well, I've got an answer to this. So I wrote back to them and said, religion is something that cannot be defined. So that's it. You can't define religion. They wrote back to me, and I'm exaggerating a little bit here, and they said, well, do you want to be paid? Yes, I would like to be paid. And they said, well, you need a definition of religion. So I thought from an academic perspective, you can't really define religion. But then I think from another perspective, religion is a term in international law, it's a term in domestic law. And a judge can't say when trying to decide a religious asylum case, oh, I can't define religion, so I don't know whether I can give you an asylum claim or not. So judges need to make that decision. So I thought about this, and I said, okay, I can't define religion. I'm not going to pretend to, but I'm going to try to talk about how religion is used in the context of law. So I thought about this a lot, and then I came up with 3 different categories, what I'll call 3 aspects of religion. Now, let's be clear, this is not a definition of religion, but when religion comes to an issue related to law, to people's lives, to politics, these 3 aspects of it seem to me to be 3 important ones. So the first aspect of religion is religion as a belief system. It is what you believe. It is why you believe it. You get this from sacred scriptures, or people tell you about this. It's the belief system that's associated with religion. A second aspect of religion is religion as identity. So religion, this is who I am. And so it's not, for some people, they will say, I was born a Muslim. I don't decide whether I'm a Muslim or not. I don't change my religion. That's who I am. That is my identity. And for some people, the third category, or the third aspect of religion is religion as a way of life. And to me, the religion as a way of life is most visibly illustrated for me in Japan. And this is where you would see people who would go from a Buddhist temple to a Taoist temple to a Shinto temple, and they would go through similar rituals. Interesting public opinion polls in Japan of what is your religion, and people will often claim multiple religions. What it will be often is a certain kind of pattern that you go through, going to the temple, clapping, washing your hands, making a wish. Now, these 3 aspects of religion as beliefs, religion as identity, or religion of way of life may be combined for some people. They'll say, I can't even divide these 3. I mean, it's all 3 of them. For some people, it's really one that has the dominant priority. For some people, the identity might even shift during life. So I was born a Catholic, and then I converted to Protestantism, and Catholicism was my identity at first, and Protestantism became an identity later. So these are shifting, and they can arrive in various combinations. When you look at issues of religion and law, religion and politics, I find that these are the 3 aspects that repeatedly occur. After I submitted the paper, there was an international conference that was held, and so experts came. They had read my paper, and I said, okay, I come up with these 3 aspects. Am I missing one? Is there a 4th that you can think of? Or are 2 of these really the same, and I'm just giving different words? And we talked about that. And ultimately, nobody had a different idea. Now, these are not magical terms. These don't solve problems, but they are a way of trying to come to understand what the issues are. A couple of years ago, I was at a conference in Cordoba, and I was on a panel with somebody from the UN, and he started out by saying the United Nations has a definition of religion. There are 3 aspects to this, and then he went through the 3 that I had given. So I thought, well, I think it, I write it, and then it comes out of the voice of the United Nations. Anyway, keep these in mind. When we get to issues of religion and politics, I think that the aspect that is really going to dominate, now personal opinion, is identity. So if we think in terms of the conflict in Northern Ireland, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this. This is an issue of Protestants fighting Catholics in Northern Ireland. Is this a religious dispute about beliefs? Is this a matter of who should be the, whom do we pay attention to? The sola scriptura is just the New Testament, or does the Pope have a role? Is that what the fight was about, or was this about something other than that? So religion as an identity is what I would say. Now, there's a very, very old joke. If you know Irish history at all, you will know the joke. So this is not original. This is not clever. This is not something exciting and new. But during the Troubles in Northern Ireland, now it's a joke, there's an atheist who came to Ireland. He thought, I'm going to survive this conflict. So he gets off the boat and he's immediately asked the question, are you a Protestant or are you a Catholic? And he says triumphantly, I am an atheist. Keep me out of your problems. And the response to that was, well, are you a Catholic atheist or are you a Protestant atheist? Now, that's where we have really the identity dominating the issue. Again, I think that when we get into problems with conflict, whether it is in Ukraine, whether it is conflicts with Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, it is that identity. This is who I am, not a matter of what did Jesus say about the use of violence. Falwell and Robertson didn't talk about that. They talked about these people who they find anathema, and God allows this violence to be used because these people are bad. Okay, so those three aspects of religion, we'll see how they come up again. Second terminology term that I want to use is to divide between what I will call spiritual religion and political religion. Now, again, these are not magical terms. This does not solve problems. It's not the end of debates about etymology or having solved problems, but just a way of thinking about it to help clarify thought rather than to resolve a problem. So I'm going to refer to spiritual religion as the kind of religion where people will read sacred texts, they will listen to ministers, they will talk with other people about it, they will try to live their own lives in accordance with these beliefs. So this is spiritual religion. Then I'm going to refer to political religion as religion that is used to instrumentalize the use of power or force. Now, we could have political religion. This can be maybe a religious group that says, if you leave our religious group, we are going to shun you. We're not going to talk to you further. Now, that's using a kind of force, not if you think of leaving our religion, we're going to talk to you and say, maybe you're making a mistake and we're going to try to convince you. That would be spiritual religion, but we're going to do something to punish you. We won't talk to you further. There are much more coercive ways, saying that I have a weapon, and if you do not convert to my religion, I will kill you for it. Now, it's much stronger, but it is the use of power, force, or the threat of force to convince people to do something that they would not otherwise do. So it is use of power and force. That's political religion. So if you think of religious leaders from the past, ask the question to them, to what extent are they teaching spiritual religion, and to what extent are they teaching political religion? Now, it's probably the case that you could take any religious leader from the past and you'll find at least a little bit of both. But I would suggest that the principal founders of religion speak in terms particularly of spiritual religion, and often their followers will use political religion. So I think that that's the case for Christianity. I think that's the case for Islam, but those are other debates and we can't get into those unless I get enough extra 3 hours. No, I don't get, okay. So we're just going to skip over those. We could talk about that, but just I want to have that differentiation. Okay, now we're going to go on to concept number 2. And this is what I'm going to talk about, the interpretation of sacred text. Certainly if we're talking about Patriarch Kirill and the invasion, we're going to be talking about how the New Testament and the Old Testament is interpreted. Now, the issue of interpretation involves all religions. What I'd like to do is to take the issue of a sacred text from one particular religion. This is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Now, this is a little bit of a peculiar case. We could take something from the New Testament or from the Quran, but it's probably, I think it's a little bit easier to see what happens in this particular text. I apologize to people who are online. This comes from the Doctrine and Covenants, chapter 89. If you want to look that up, we will talk about this. And I want to use this example, and I've handed out copies of this to some of you to see how a sacred text becomes interpreted over time. Now, when I'm going to be using this example from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, popularly known as the Mormons, is not any anti-Mormon issue. This is just to see how people interpret text. And I would say you go to any religion, and every religion that I'm familiar with does the same sort of thing. So let's just look at this. Now, this is a revelation, according to the Mormon Church, that comes from God. This is God the Father. This is the God who created the universe to Joseph Smith, his prophet, in 1833. So it's called a word of wisdom. And this is something that helps separate Mormons from others. So the Mormons are known for this. And I would say this becomes part of Mormon identity of what you can eat and not eat. Now, in many religions, there are prohibited foods and permitted foods. Well, Mormons have their own. And what will happen now in the Mormon Church is that the rules will say no drinking of coffee, no drinking of tea. Those are absolutely prohibited. No smoking of tobacco and no alcohol. So those are the prohibitions that come from that are part of the Mormon Church, called the Word of Wisdom. If you want to be a Mormon in good standing, you have what is called a temple recommend. And once every 2 years, you need to go to your bishop and talk to your bishop, and the bishop will ask you, do you understand and observe the word of wisdom? And the specific questions that will come up are, do you drink coffee, tea, smoke, or drink alcohol? If you answer yes to those, well, you've got a problem. You're not going to get your temple recommend. Okay, those are the four. Now let's go look at what it comes from Doctrine and Covenants, chapter 89, from this particular revelation. So look at verse number 2, where it says, this is God handing this down and says, I'm giving this to you, not by commandment or constraint. Well, this is not a law that I'm giving to you. What I'm doing is God is giving you some information that will help you lead a healthy life. So that is very kind of God to help us know, because we don't necessarily know. So this is some friendly advice. Now, I'm the one who put the word friendly in there, but this is not a commandment. That's what it says in verse 2. It's not a commandment. These are healthy advice. Okay, so if we go on in this, and I wish we had more time to look at this and have a discussion, but that's the constraint. So if we get to number 5, it says that inasmuch as any man drinketh wine or strong drink among you, behold, it is not good, neither meat in the sight of your Father. Only, okay, so this is not good. So alcohol, well, wine or strong drink, that's not really good for you. It doesn't say it is prohibited. That's not really good for you. And then it goes on to say, well, okay, there's an exception for wine, and that is if you are having wine as part of the sacrament, or the equivalent of the Catholic Mass. So if you're in this ritual, then you can have wine in this case, provided that you prepared the wine yourself. Now, I can assure you that nowhere in the Mormon Church does anybody think, okay, it's okay to have wine in sacrament service. That's just sort of been forgotten. So there's a specific exemption, and that's not observed. So why this is coming from God, and God says this is a good thing to do, but now you can't do it. So we've got an interpretation issue. Again, strong drinks are not for the belly, but for the washing of your body. So that's verse 7. Okay, so it's not good for you, but it's not prohibited for you. So not like the modern interpretation. So you say, okay, for Mormons, all right, so alcohol is good for washing your body. If you ask Mormons, how many of you use alcohol for washing your bodies? They would say no, maybe a little bit of rubbing alcohol as an antiseptic, but other than that, no. So God's giving this advice. Well, some of the advice we're not really interested in because it somehow seems to be different from the other advice. So we're picking and choosing. Okay, and tobacco, so verse 8, is not for the body, neither for the belly. It's not good, but it's okay but it's good for herbs. So if you ask Mormons, how many of you use tobacco for bruises? The answer will be 0. The idea of even doing that is repugnant. So this is God's advice. Use tobacco for bruises. Well, we're going to ignore that friendly advice from God because it doesn't fit in this other conception. Okay, verse 12 is flesh of the beast and the fowl of the air should be used sparingly. So eat meat sparingly. Now, when I gave you the 4 prohibitions, I didn't say anything about eating meat. So if you go to a Mormon temple recommend meeting, they don't ask you, do you eat meat sparingly? Do you eat meat every day? No questions about that. You can eat meat at every single meal, and there's no problem. So some of the verses will just be forgotten. Now, there's all of the source of all of these is God. God telling us what is good for us as human beings. But this becomes ignored later. One that I skipped over, number 9, where it says, and again, hot drinks are not for the body or belly. Again, it doesn't say they are prohibited, but they're not good for you. Hot drinks. Now, when I told you what was prohibited and prohibited Mormon church, I didn't say hot drinks. I said coffee and tea. Well, coffee and tea is not mentioned in the word of wisdom, only hot drink. So if I say, is hot chocolate a hot drink? Well, according to the Mormon interpretation, hot chocolate is not a hot drink. Well, what about iced tea? Oh, iced tea is a hot drink. So how does this happen? And what we have is the terms come from God. Sometimes they're clear, sometimes they're not so clear. I keep hitting that. I hope it's not making noise for others. Some things are just forgotten. Some things are changed. It doesn't follow. It doesn't make sense. Okay, so some people will say, well, it's because coffee and tea have caffeine and that's what's prohibited. Well, is caffeine prohibited in chocolate? No, that's not prohibited. So you can eat chocolate with caffeine in it. That's okay. And recently you can drink Coca-Cola with caffeine in it. That's permitted as well. So it's not caffeine. That's not the issue. It's not the temperature. Well, what is it? It is something that became interpreted later to have to carry the weight. Okay, so here's how this goes through with this case with the Mormon church. Again, this is not particularly criticizing Mormons. I think it's really clear in this case, but this would be true, I think, in virtually every religion doing something like that. If we were to go into any religion with which you are probably more familiar, we might end up having more of a debate about it. That might be fun, but wouldn't be fast. Okay, so this point number 2 is the interpretation of sacred scripture. When we get back to Patriarch Kirill, it is going to be something that we will see again. Okay, the third point that I want to make, so our Roman numeral 3, if you're following along with me, is people invoke God's authority. So religious figures will invoke God's authority to justify human wishes. So that's sort of my provocative claim. Now, not all religious people do this. People who do religion and politics will do this. They will invoke God's authority to justify violence. They will invoke God's authority to justify political positions. They will invoke God's authority to justify prejudices and hatreds. They will invoke God's authority to justify their religious identity. So coming back to Northern Ireland, for Catholics to kill Protestants or Protestants to kill Catholics. In the name of God, they are trying to destroy somebody else's identity. Now, Jesus, as far as I know, never said, well, it's okay to kill Protestants or it's okay to kill Catholics. Jesus doesn't talk about that. But the followers of Jesus will take certain kinds of concepts from the New Testament, things that are good or things that are bad. They will ignore other things that are pretty clearly in the scriptures. Just ignore them. They'll take things in the scriptures which are not entirely clear, and they will then give a very specific definition to that. So from point number 2, on interpretation of scripture, we see how that happens with the word of wisdom. Now I'm saying that this is going to be something that is going to be used not to talk about what you should eat or not eat, but how you justify actions that you're going to be taking on behalf of political religion. Okay, are we clear where we're going? I hope. Okay, so the ways that the particular issues that will be important for invoking God's authority will be on issues of identity. So this can be, and I want this to be clear, I'm not talking about any specific religion. I will say that all religions do, or let's say human beings in every religious tradition will go through this process that I'm talking about. Not everybody in the religion does it, but some people will do. Those who justify violence in the name of religion typically are going to be doing this. Okay, so the first one is the specific one, now we've already talked about this, is identity. And one of the interesting forms of identity is nationalism. Now, if we go back to the time of Jesus or the time of Muhammad or the foundations of the Orthodox Church, we didn't have nations. There were things that we now call race, things that we now call ethnic groups. Now, I think most anthropologists will say even to talk about race is a misnomer, ethnicity is not fair, but let's just put that aside. I mean, I think that that's correct, but just putting that aside, the identities are not being defined in terms of race or in terms of ethnicity originally, and certainly not in terms of nations. So so I live in Morocco. Certainly there's nothing in the Quran that says, and yes, Moroccans can go to war with Algerians in order to defend their Moroccan identity. There's nothing like that. In Christianity, there is nothing like this. What we have gone from is to have a world where it's a lot more diffuse, where we have empires, we have overlapping empires, to points where we now have nations, nation states, where people are going to identify or going to associate themselves with this nation which is an artificial construct, didn't exist 200 years ago, or maybe we pretend that it existed 200 years ago, but it didn't exist 200 years ago. And now we will see the conflict. Where it becomes most laughable form to me is with football. So last week, the Moroccans defeated the Egyptians, and Morocco was excited. They beat Egypt 1-0 in football, and it was a very big deal in Morocco. From what I understand, I don't follow this closely. A week later, the Moroccan team played an American team, and the Americans won 8-0. Not discussed in Morocco at all. I mean, same team beat Egypt, and this is a cause for celebration. So it's not as we are all Muslims, we are all North Africans, we are not part of the non-Western world. It is Morocco now against Egypt. And how do we decide this? Or be Morocco versus Algeria? It's by this border that isn't, in fact, can be contested. So if you're on one side of the border, you're a faithful Algerian. If you're on the other side, you're a faithful Moroccan. This happens for religion as well. How is it that you identify yourself? So religion, nationalism. We will see, just with Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson. So what was the religious war there? It was a religious war against Americans. This is against the United States. Now, somehow, this is not a longstanding issue of Christianity versus Islam. This is an attack upon us as Americans. So taking this identity of Americans now and taking that as a subset of Christianity and making that part of the interpretation. A second issue, and I'm just going to be giving some, that is quite prominent, is on issues related to gender, sexuality, abortion, that cluster of issues. And those may be within that cluster, people may have very different perceptions on abortion versus feminism. So some might say one is okay, the other is not okay. So I'm not saying these are all the same and people who are in these groups all agree, but those issues particularly provoke religious conflict. So Falwell and Robertson say, okay, so these feminists, these gays and lesbians, they're partly responsible for these attacks. The fact that abortion has been taking place, that they're responsible for the attacks, as if, okay, so abortion is bad because people die, therefore God allows people to be killed who had nothing to do with that. What is the logical thinking process there? I submit to you, there's no logical thinking process there at all. It is reaction. It is identifying with something. So abortion is bad. Okay, well then if you kill in the name of, if you kill to oppose abortion, or if it's God's punishment for abortion, well then killing is okay. So it's not killing is bad. It is, well, who's doing the killing for what reason? And it's not simply punishing somebody who has committed a crime, so capital punishment, not no praise of capital punishment, but that sort of makes sense. For God to allow people to die because abortions are taking place, it would seem as though maybe God really prefers death rather than life. But that sort of connection is not made. Anyway, a second issue that we're going to see pervasive in using religion to justify violence, using religion to engage in politics is sex and gender. That's one that I sort of don't understand. I'll tell you a little bit later. I've been talking with some Russian friends about Patriarch Kirill having a very problematic issue with sexuality, with feminists and with gays and lesbians. And so I asked why this issue has such prominence. And there is sort of no particular explanation. Okay, so another one that we see is, as I've already mentioned, this is still on my point number 3, so invoking God's authority to justify or to explain violence. Violence happens, and either God caused this violence to happen, God allows this violence to happen, or people do something in the name of violence. So we can use God to support violence, justify our own actions, to explain. So Robertson and Falwell were explaining God has allowed this to happen. God lifted the curtain. So because of the feminists and gays and the ACLU, God lifts the curtain that protects the United States, and then we have this violence. So we asked Falwell and Robertson, so when Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7th, 1941, was this because of the gays and lesbians? ACLU didn't exist. Well, actually, ACLU did exist that time, but gays and lesbians, is that why this happened? When you have this sort of religious thought process that I'm talking about, logic doesn't matter. Counter examples do not matter. It is simply saying it that becomes justified in itself. One of the aspects of this, so this is the last one I will mention on this point number 3, invoking God's authority. Something that is very common to do is to create or to see the world in dualistic terms or Manichaean terms for those of you who are religious scholars. So the world is divided between the good and the bad, the good and good and evil. And the world is pretty sharply divided. So if you say something like, well, some things are difficult to understand, is this good or bad? Then you don't understand because it is really good or it is bad. And to be clear, that theme, which comes in people practicing political religion, has its sources in sacred scriptures as well. So this is not something that these people invent and add to religion. It can be found in the religions themselves. But what they will do, I argue, is that they will take this belief in the dualistic world, good versus evil, light versus dark, and they will shift around what fits in the good and what fits in the evil. So the concept of good and evil, Manichaean world, can be in sacred scriptures, but what you place in these different categories, that is going to shift over time. So this dualistic world is going to be part of the way of thinking about the use of politics. Again, all of this is to help us understand what Patriarch Kirill did. We're getting to that slowly, but surely we are getting to Patriarch Kirill. I want to take a look at what I'll call number 4 and take a look at Christian orthodoxy. And I think understanding a little bit about Orthodox Christianity can be helpful in understanding what Kirill has done, what Kirill has said, and what the justification is. Now, if you come from what I will call the West, what Kirill will call the West, so if we think of Europe, so I'm from the United States, North America, sort of this Western world, it's not really a geographical term as we know. So Australia is in the West and Morocco's in the East, or I don't know, it doesn't make any sense. So these are terms that do not make sense geographically. They make sense in terms of ideologies and how people approach things. So I grew up in the West, in the United States. And so when I'm learning about world history, I have a certain kind of understanding of this. And I think Europeans will have some kind of understanding about what I'm about to say. Those of you who are not from the Western world will think that's a little bit peculiar, and you will have a different sort of perspective. But just something that is very common will be, so for Western civilization, that's the kind of term that will be used. So United States, Europe particularly, but you think, okay, the beginning of Western civilization is with the Greeks. Now, if you're really liberal and open-minded, you might say, well, maybe it starts with the Persians, or, well, the Egyptians had a role in this, but really the beginning is the Greeks. So they're Greeks, and they're sort of these people who existed bound before there, and maybe they had some importance. Now, this is standard formation of Western thinking. Okay, so it begins with the Greeks with some forerunners, of course. Then it goes to the Romans. Then we have this strange little thing that happens that in Bethlehem, part of the Roman Empire, Jesus is born. And then we have beginning of Christianity. And in the West, the next step is, after Greece and Rome, is, well, actually we stay with Rome, but now we have Christian Rome and the Pope being in Rome. So this is part of the world. So things that are not taking place within this framework, they are not really part of the West. Now, if you're in Ireland, you think, well, beginning of the papacy, well, Ireland's mostly a pagan country, but what Ireland, the conception will be, slowly Ireland becomes absorbed into the West. And so Ireland will take this part. In North America, the same thing, they don't exist at the time originally, but this is the center. So we have now the center in Christian Rome. That's the center of Western civilization throughout the Middle Ages. Okay, so Latin is going to be the language. If we say, well, what about the Muslims? Well, they're sort of on the periphery. Or if you say, what about what's happening in Moscow in the year 800? Answer, nothing. Moscow's a forest at the time. If you say, what's happening in Kyiv in the year 1000, well, we've got the beginning of Ukrainian Orthodoxy. But if you're in this Western section, those are on the periphery. So what's happening in Islam, or what's happening in Arabia, or what's happening in Iran, all of those are not really part of the story. Then there's China and Japan, and we can be perfectly respectful of those civilizations, but it's not the center of what we think of as certainly as Western civilization. So there is a difference there. After we have the Middle Ages, we have the Renaissance. And so the Renaissance, we can say, sort of takes the highway from Rome up to Florence. Now, I'm being casual, as you can see, but we now have the Renaissance. And so this is the beginning of the challenging of the papacy and the beginning of challenging of Western conceptions. And after we have the Renaissance, then we move into religious wars. And so we have a terrible thing that happens to Catholicism is Martin Luther is born. And so then we have the rivalry. And then for part of Western civilization, the way I'm taught in school, okay, the big civil war is between the Protestants and the Catholics. Okay, and so we have the Protestant Reformation, then we have the Catholic Counter-Reformation. That's the center of the struggle. And we say, well, okay, at this time when we have the center of struggle and what we're studying in school, what's happening in Egypt? Well, nothing particularly important. That's not really involved. Or what's happening in Constantinople? Not particularly important. No, it's there, and maybe it's important for them, but it's not really part of our story. And then we go in Western civilization. After we have the Renaissance and we have the Protestant Reformation, then we have the scientific revolution. And so then we start even moving towards Oxford and Cambridge, where we see parts of the scientific revolution. It's not just in those two places, of course, but that becomes part of it. And it starts another challenge to what is going on. After the scientific revolution, we then go into the industrial revolution. We have centers of intellect and centers of power moving from the Rome of the papacy. We'll move to France or move to Spain and the Spanish Empire. When that starts to collapse, then power moves to France. Then power moves to England, and then the British Empire. So by the 19th century, by the beginning of 19th century, the center of Western civilization is London. Well, at least it's the center of what the stock market is. So that's the center of world power, most powerful army, most powerful navy based in London, and Ireland suffers the consequences before the 19th century. But the consequences of this expanding English and British power. Then it comes to the 20th century, we have these two big wars, and the wars are these are internal wars. These are wars between the Germans on the one side, sometimes with the Italians, sometimes not, sometimes with Bulgarians, sometimes not, but it is Germany versus all of the other countries. So the United States, France, Spain is out of this, Netherlands and others. So this is the war. This is the center of civilization. So we study this. At the end of World War II, the center of civilization moves to, of all places, not a good idea, moves to New York City. So that becomes the financial capital and intellectual capital of the world, but the United States becomes the dominant power. So that's sort of the story that we hear from the West, whether we're talking about the beautiful Gothic cathedrals or Romanesque cathedrals or modern architecture. This is sort of a Western orientation. Okay, so let's put that aside and say, all right, let's suppose you're Orthodox. How does this story go? You're not at the periphery of all of this. You are in the center of civilization. So when Kirill is speaking, he is speaking from a perspective of the center of civilization. All right, so that's important. So we start out, if we're doing the story as seen from the Orthodox perspective or from Kirill's perspective, okay, we can begin with the Greeks and Romans, that's okay. Then Jesus is born, that's fine. Then we have Constantinople becomes the center of I'll say civilization, the center of Orthodox civilization. It's Constantinople. That's where the riches are. It's the most intellectually robust part of the Christian world. The Muslim world is still more robust intellectually, trade, finance at this time. We then have the Orthodox world based in Constantinople. That's the center of civilization. Okay, so when we're in the center of civilization in the Orthodox world, then what are those French doing? Well, they're sort of these dirty people who are, not any comment, but just they are barbarians who are living out there. The English are even worse. The Irish, we won't even talk about the Irish. Americans, they don't even exist yet. Okay, so there are these Europeans who are on the Western Europe, we call Western Europeans. They're on the periphery of civilization, and we are in the center of civilization, and it's Constantinople. Okay, well, a problem happens to Constantinople. The Muslim world begins, and the Muslim world seizes Constantinople. And now we've got a problem that the center of orthodoxy, Constantinople, becomes Istanbul, although the name Constantinople still continues to this day and will be used. But Istanbul now becomes the center for the Muslim world, more than any other single place. There are obviously more than one, but that becomes the center. So it's still the same place, and the patriarchate for the ecumenical patriarch will still be based in Constantinople, but it is now under ultimate Muslim rule. So somehow it's occupied. Somehow it's under the control of others. So in the Russian Orthodox Church, they will refer to the three Romes. First Rome is under the papacy. Second Rome, and that's brief. Second Rome is Constantinople. And the third Rome is Moscow. And that concept of Moscow as the third Rome is fundamental in the Russian Orthodox Church, and it is fundamental to the worldview of Patriarch Kirill. So this is now the center of civilization. One of the funny things that happened in social media, and there are not very many fun things that happen related to the war in Ukraine, but Russians were saying, okay, Moscow and the Russian Orthodox Church and the Moscow Patriarch, this is now the third Rome. We are now the center of civilization. And so the Ukrainians correctly said, okay, well, here's a picture of Ukraine in the year 1100. And they showed a picture of the cave monastery in Kiev, maybe the single most important religious building in Slavic Orthodox Christianity, the cave monastery. If you're not Orthodox, it's a very strange place. Go visit that as soon as you can. But so this is the center of what becomes Russian Orthodoxy. Okay, so 1100, here we have the cave monastery in Kiev. And so the Ukrainians say, here's what it was in the 11th century. Now we're going to show you a picture of Moscow in the 11th century. And the photograph that appears is a forest. No buildings, no structures, no huts, nothing. It's a forest. In fact, the origins of Russian Orthodoxy are from Kiev. Fundamental to Patriarch Kirill's view, Kiev is the center of Russian Orthodoxy. Now, that's a little bit difficult to say, but for Kirill's worldview, they are sort of not part of us, but we control them. It began there, but really the center now is Moscow. If we look at Christianity, maybe we say, okay, Jerusalem once is the center of Christianity when Jesus is there, but then it becomes for Western Christians, Rome. So we sort of own Jerusalem, that's ours, Nazareth, Bethlehem, these places of the Bible, but now we move to Rome. Well, for the Russian Orthodox Church, okay, it began in Kiev, that's important. We want to control it, yes, but the real center of Orthodox Christianity is now Moscow. Okay, so we go from, the center of the world is Moscow. It is not London, it is not New York, it is not Rome, it is not Paris. The center of the Slavic Orthodox world is Moscow. Now, other Orthodox, non-Slavic, so non-Russian will say, no, the center of it's still Constantinople, but the Russians will say, no, it's something different. Now, from the Russian perspective, they'll say, here we are at the center of civilization, and look at what those Westerners did to us. Now, notice when I gave the history of Western civilization I didn't say anything about Western invasions of the East. So for the Russian perspective, they will say, okay, let's see how the West dealt with us. First example will be the Crusades. So on the Second Crusade, the armies come and they sack Constantinople. They trick their way into Constantinople. And so you have those good Catholic Christians coming in and massacring Orthodox Christians. They were just getting ready to go massacre Muslims in Jerusalem. So on their way there, they first dealt with Jews, massacred them, then they got to the Orthodox, they massacred the Orthodox, and then they went off to Palestine, Jerusalem, before doing the massacres there. But first time that we see these Western Christians in the Orthodox world is when they come as part of the Crusades. Okay, we'll flash forward a little bit in time. There are other events, but what will be prominent is the invasion of Napoleon into Russia. So here we have Western army. Now, we're in Russia. In Russia during the time of Napoleon, we even like the French. French is the language of culture. It's the language that we speak. And these French come in and invade and try to destroy our country. But they don't succeed because we are the center of civilization. We're the center of God's world. Okay, so we have the Crusades and we have Napoleon. In the 20th century, Adolf Hitler invades the Soviet Union. Okay, Adolf Hitler invades the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union repels. So the perspective from Orthodoxy, from Russian Orthodoxy, is here we are minding our own business. We are living true Christianity, and these Westerners keep coming and invading us. Now, in the Western version of the world, it's not. We repeatedly invaded Russia. No, it is. We're sort of minding our own business, and well, that guy Napoleon went off and did it in the Crusaders. That was really a bad thing, but you know, they're Crusaders. And Hitler, yes, we all agree that that was very bad what Hitler did. But these are sort of on the margins of the viewpoint from the Western world. From the Russian perspective, they are our threat. They are the enemy. Then after World War II, we have the Cold War. And in the Russian version, which is the opposite of the American version, we have an aggressive NATO that is putting its armaments on our borders and threatening us and engaging in an arms race. Now, that's a very simplistic version of the Russian version, but it is seeing the West as a threat to Russia. So the enemies are NATO, the Cold War. Okay, the Cold War then ends, and we have the next invasion by the West into Russia, and the invasion is Western values. So think of the 1990s. Now, this doesn't start in the 1990s, but just think of this as convenient. So the Soviet Union collapses in 1991. What happens? Westerners move in with their financial investments. They move in with businesses. They move in with their human rights values. So the Westerners bring in these notion of human rights into the world, and they bring in their notions of feminism. Now, that's just about the worst thing that could possibly happen, right? Bringing feminism in. So human rights, feminism, and then later, the rights of gays and lesbians. So these start coming in from the perspective of Kirill. This is one more example of a threat to us, to our identity coming from the West. Now, in the West, there's not the particular conception, okay, we're going to go and invade Russia with our human rights. It is just simply human rights are universal. They should be everywhere in the world. Russia's somewhere in the world. Sorry, I keep hitting that. Russia is somewhere in the world, and so Russia should be involved in this. Anyway, we have these threats that are constantly coming to us. Let me do a little bit of a detour on this. You may have noticed I keep referring to Kirill as Metropolitan Kirill. So I met him in 1998. I was introduced by a colleague who was his spokesman. So some of you may know Vsevolod Chaplin. I don't know. Vsevolod Chaplin was on the OSCE panel of experts on religion. So I knew Vsevolod Chaplin, and Metropolitan Kirill, so Metropolitan Kirill, Smolensk and Kaliningrad, was at that time the equivalent of the foreign minister for the Russian Orthodox Church. When I met him, and I went as part of a US delegation to talk about human rights in Russia in 1998. And so Kirill, interesting person, metropolitan at the time, wanted to talk about human rights, and he had very little interest in Western human rights. He made the claim that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights and the others did not apply to Russia, because those treaties those conventions were all ratified by the Soviet Union, and Russia is no longer in the Soviet Union. Now, that's a really bad argument. Russia needed to have revoked its acceptance of that. Russia is a successor state, so the argument is just bad. He was not really interested in talking about international law. He was interested in saying that those do not apply to Russia. Also, I pointed out that Russia had just recently ratified the European Convention of Human Rights. And even if his first argument were true, then the new Russian government had just ratified the European Covenant, so that didn't apply. But those little arguments were not particularly important or impressive. What was impressive is these are not orthodox values. They have nothing to do with us. These are foreign imports, and the conversation did not go particularly well, though there are no surprises here. Okay, so that's sort of from the Russian Orthodox perspective on Western world. Now let's talk about Ukraine as part of the Ukraine and Russia. So Russia's invaded Ukraine. So what's the relationship between Ukraine and Russia? Well, I've already suggested the beginning of what we now call Russian Orthodoxy began in Kiev. So the Prince of Kiev, Vladimir, in the year 988, thought, okay, we're all pagans now, but those people around us, we have Muslims in the world, we have Christian Orthodox, we have Catholic, Roman Catholics. What should we be here in Kiev? And so he sends people out to meet with different religions. And one of his delegations goes to Constantinople. And so this is Constantinople still under the Orthodox Church. And they walk into the church Hagia Sophia, one of the most beautiful buildings in the world, extraordinarily impressive building, the center of Christian Orthodoxy at the time. And it is at that time, in the 10th century, it was the largest building anywhere in the world. The Romans had never built anything with a dome as large as Hagia Sophia, just extraordinary building. If you go to Istanbul, that is the place to go. And that's not an insider's tip, that is blatantly obvious. So his delegation goes inside Hagia Sophia, and they are struck by the impressive. Then Hagia Sophia is covered with gold on the inside, and they return to Kiev and they say, we felt as if we were walking into heaven. This must be the true religion. And so Ukraine, Kiev becomes Orthodox. And so from the 10th century, this is the beginning. Now, this is still while Russia is largely Moscow doesn't exist at all. St. Petersburg obviously doesn't exist. So there are little villages and towns, but the center of this, what I will call now Russian Orthodox world, though that's not a term that would be used at the time, center of the Russian Orthodox world begins in Ukraine. Many years later, Moscow starts, then the emperors of Moscow become increasingly more powerful, and then they acquire, by 17th century, they acquire Ukraine. And so Ukraine becomes part of Moscow, part of Russia. So it's acquired not by popular referendum or vote, but Ukraine becomes Russian. I'm going to say Russian Orthodox, though these terms are anachronistic, so we don't want to go too far with that. Okay, so ultimately, the Ukrainians do not particularly like the idea of Russians coming in and telling them that they are going to be under the Moscow Patriarchate. So we've got the Patriarch in Moscow, and the Patriarch in Moscow wants to control Ukraine, and Ukrainians, to some extent, do not like that. Now, history is complicated, not particularly important for our purposes here, but certainly important for the story. So during 1919, after the Russian revolutions, Ukraine announces its complete separation from Russia and the Russian Orthodox Church. During Soviet times, the Russian Orthodox Church, with the assistance of the Soviet state, takes increasing control over Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So there ends up being more than one Orthodox Church in Ukraine. If we were to say by the year 2010, we could say in a sense there are three Orthodox churches in Ukraine. There is the Russian Orthodox Church, there's the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Moscow Patriarchate. So this is Ukrainian Orthodox Church, but they look upon the Patriarch in Moscow as the ruler, as Maronite Christians will look upon the Pope as the head of the church, even though they will have different practices. Then there's sort of an autonomous, again, that's not the correct term, an autonomous Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So there's something of a rivalry among the three Orthodox churches in Ukraine. So Ukraine is an independent state after 1991. Russia is an independent state after 1991. The Moscow Patriarchate of the Russian Orthodox Church wants to be controlling things in Ukraine with this most glorious building. There are many more than this, but the cave monastery in Kiev is sort of the symbol of all of this. This is where it begins. And so Moscow wants control over that. Okay, 1919 or 2019, there is a settlement. And the settlement is through the ecumenical patriarchate in Constantinople or Istanbul. So under Bartholomew, it is said we will have the Ukrainian Orthodox Church under the Metropolitan of Kiev. So that will be an autocephalous church. That is a completely independent church under the family of Orthodoxy. There is the Russian Orthodox Church. That is a completely autocephalous church. Then we will have the the Ukrainian Orthodox Church under the Moscow Patriarchate. So after 2019, we have essentially two Ukrainian Orthodox churches. If you go back to 2008, it's going to be different. So by 2019, two Orthodox churches, Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Kiev, Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Moscow Patriarchate. And the two Orthodox churches in Ukraine really don't like each other that much. So the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Moscow Patriarchate, controls the cave monastery and probably the richest properties. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Kiev, resents this still strong influence of Moscow over them, and they want the other monasteries. Even after the war broke out, it's not as though Ukrainians all said, let's get together and be one happy, united Orthodox Church. The rivalries continued, even though almost all Ukrainians reject the invasion. So for Patriarch Kirill, what he wants to have happen prior to the invasion, what he would like is to see the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Kiev Metropolitanate disappear and it all become under the Russian Orthodox Church. So in a sense, that would be his goal. Not that he says there should be an invasion for this goal, but that's what he would like to happen. He would like the Moscow Patriarchate to be increasingly powerful in all of the territories of the former Soviet Union. So there are Moscow Patriarchates in Lithuania, Latvia, so they exist all over the world, and he wants increasing control, and he also wants the local indigenous Ukrainian churches to disappear. So he would like to be the center of all of this. So that's to some extent his goal. All right, now we go to part number 5, and we come to the invasion and the March 6th sermon of Patriarch Kirill. So Kirill is today age 76. So I have Russian contacts, which is to some extent they confirm with much better knowledge what I perceive with less knowledge. So I don't have disagreements with them. I'm relying on them to some extent. I'm not going to use any names because that can be dangerous for their health. So I'm saying this from the perspective that there is some inside information, but this is not deeply informative. So Kirill is born in 1946, age 76 today. He is in terrible health. So if you read tomorrow that Patriarch Kirill has died, do not be surprised. Now, he may go on for a long period of time. The Patriarch of the Georgian Orthodox Church, 20 years ago, people would have said he could die any day now, and he's still somehow holding on. So I make no particular assumptions, but he's in very bad health. There are rumors that he has fainted several times, including after this speech on March 6th, or a sermon on March 6th, he would like to leave a legacy, as does Putin wants to leave a legacy of having helped consolidate either the former Russian Empire or the Russian Orthodox Church. He became patriarch in 2009, and it was predicted that he would become patriarch. So even when I met with him in 1998, the presumption was he would be the next patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, though nothing was guaranteed. Now, I mentioned to you that I was introduced by the Cephalad chaplain, a colleague of mine. Chaplain was the spokesman for Kirill when he was effectively the foreign minister, and then one of the principal spokesmen for him after he became patriarch. Chaplain also had a radio broadcast that was broadcast all through Moscow. It's sort of, if you want to know about Russian Orthodoxy, call in and talk to Chaplain. So you can ask him questions and he will tell you what he thinks. So there were Chaplain died in 2020, age 51, most immediately from a heart attack, but he had a severe case of diabetes. So he died 2 years ago. He was, some would say, one of the two most identifiable, recognizable Russian Orthodox in Russia. So the first one would be Kirill, and the second would be Chaplain. Now, Chaplain did not hold a high position. He held administratively high positions, but not, he's not an archbishop or a metropolitan, but he's very well known in the Russian media. So part of the story that I have is, I partly wonder to what extent should I say things that I think are true. I'm not positive that they're true. I have no reason to doubt it. If I were writing an academic article, I wouldn't publish it because I don't have that confidence. Is this going to be broadcast or be available on the internet? Okay, well, it means whether I say this following stories or not.
We can pause it.
Okay, pause begins here. Now we have Kirill, who wants to enhance the power prestige of the Russian Orthodox Church, looks upon dissenters in Ukraine as not being entirely legitimate. He is angry with the ecumenical patriarchate in Constantinople that allowed the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to exist as its own metropolitanate outside of Moscow. So there's been a war between Kirill and Bartholomew, and so the Russian Orthodox Church is to some extent fled from this. Okay, so this is part of the background. Now, with the return in terms of Ukraine, Vladimir Putin has the idea, which he has not been shy about making clear, is that his role model is Peter the Great. Now, one of the problems with Peter the Great as being his role model is that Peter the Great is also one of the enemies of the Russian Orthodox Church. Peter the Great is accused by Kirill of having brought secularism to Russia. So there's a little bit of a problem. Putin wants to come back to the old Russian Empire, and Ukraine is part of that old Russian Empire. Now, this is part of the Russian Empire since the 17th century, not before. So this is not going back to prehistoric times. This is going back to times of modern history. So Putin wants that. Already in 2014, Putin seized the Crimea. Putin then decided, based upon two principal reasons, that he would invade Ukraine. One is that Ukraine is part of historic Russia, and then Ukraine has been taken over by Nazis. So these are the grounds that are used by Putin for invading. Now, if you follow the news at all, you're probably aware that the Russians believed the idea was that they would be able to seize Ukraine within 3 to 4 days. The government of Zelensky would collapse, Zelensky would flee, and the Russians would take over Ukraine, just as they took over the Crimea in 2014. So there would be some cost, but certainly would not be a bloody war of attrition, which is what it appears to be as of right now. What will happen, I don't know, but it looks as though it's going to be continuing for some for some time. So this is the reason that Kirill, or that Putin decides to invade. On March 6, 2022, we finally got to that. You thought we'd never get there, and we almost didn't. Kirill gives a speech that justifies the Russian invasion of Ukraine. He has given other speeches, one to the parliament, which if this were a 3-day seminar, we would talk about that as well. But this is his first justification. And I want us to look at that. You will have it so you can look at it later. I'm going to observe the time, which means I have 5 minutes. So you can look at this later, but let me just talk about some points. But look at this think of this in terms of the Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, in terms of the use of identity, on how scriptures are selectively used, and not how some things are emphasized, some things are just completely ignored. Okay, it starts out, this is a sermon that's given on Forgiveness Sunday. So this is the week before the beginning of Lent. And this is a time that we think about, as you can see from the speech, life, renewal, forgiveness. Okay, so that's the context for giving a speech justifying the invasion of Ukraine. And let's definitely keep in mind that when Russia invades Ukraine, there are Ukrainian Orthodox people in Ukraine who are going to be fighting against the Russian soldiers. Now, some of those are connected with the Moscow Patriarchate. So Kirill is supporting an invasion by Russians that will kill his own parishioners. He is aware of that. Now, what I'm sure that he didn't want to happen, what actually happened, but he knows that his own parishioners are going to be killed. He also knows that the rival parishioners for the Kiev Metropolitanate, both of them are going to be dying. He also knows that Russian Orthodox Church members who are in the Russian army are going to die. So this is a war of Orthodox people killing other Orthodox people, different versions of Orthodoxy, but this is a fratricidal war that is taking place. And Kirill is going to justify that, and he's going to do this on Forgiveness Sunday, where after he talks about the importance of life. Okay, so what's his justification for this? Now, he doesn't quote Jesus at all during this sermon. He does say that what he is concerned about are these Western values that are invading Ukraine. And we've already talked about this. This is one of the Western forms of invasion to attack Russia. Napoleon, the Crusaders, materialism, human rights. This is one of those. And so what we need to do is reject those. One of the problems is excessive consumption. So that's what the West does, is excessive consumption. Now, while we were offline, we talked a little bit about Kirill's own form of consumption, suggesting that maybe excessive consumption depends on who you are rather than it being bad. Okay, so we've got these values. Well, what's the real triggering issue that we have? What provokes this? I mean, just because we have countries that promote consumption or human rights doesn't mean we invade them, or certainly we wouldn't say the United States should invade Russia because Russia doesn't accept human rights. That would seem to be a little bit curious and a little bit contradictory. Well, what we have is, and this is on the bottom, this is on 1, 2, 3, end of the 4th paragraph. The test is very simple and at the same time terrible. It's gay pride parade. This is the triggering cause for Kirill's view. The requirements for many to hold a gay pride parade are a test of loyalty to the most powerful political powers of the world. So in Ukraine, they want to have a gay pride parade, and that is supported by the West and the invaders, and we cannot allow that to happen on Orthodox territory. I mean, gay pride, what could be worse than that? The powerful countries in the world are trying to do this. But people in the Donbass and others in Ukraine, they reject this. So this is what we need to do. Now we ask to Kirill the question, how many Orthodox, these are Orthodox on both sides, how many Orthodox believers does he think should be killed, should be massacred? How many children should be massacred and killed in order to prevent a gay pride parade? What would be the number? So one number for Russian soldiers is 30,000. Is that a good exchange for not having a gay pride parade? That is the consequence of what he is saying. Get to the issue of dualism. So this is on the second page, so the third paragraph down, second full paragraph. Therefore, forgiveness must be accompanied by the indispensable preservation of the right to stand on the side of light and on the side of God's truth. So we are on the side of light and God's truth. Therefore, the consequence is it is permissible to use violence because we are on the right side. That is not a problem. Then we go on the next paragraph. We will be faithful to the word of God. What we are doing is following God's edicts. So that's what it is. This is a question between holiness and sin. So we're going to forget about, the actual percentage of values of what's important. Gay pride, well, even if you think that's bad, how many people should die for this? We don't do this justification. There isn't a quoting of quotations from Jesus in Metropolitan Kirill. He does say elsewhere, both Christianity and Judaism condemn homosexuality. And in another speech, he quotes Leviticus, where a man shall not lie with a man as with a woman, and two statements by Apostle Paul, not by Jesus, where Apostle Paul says sodomy is an abomination. Now, the Apostle Paul, and in Leviticus, it is never said, and if you find somebody engaging in this sin, you should murder them, or you should murder their families, or you should murder their civilization, or you should invade the country and destroy them. So, okay, even if it is a sin, that does not justify it. How do we justify this punitive action based upon this sin that Jesus doesn't talk about? Jesus doesn't talk about abortion, doesn't talk about homosexuality, does not talk about women's rights. It's not part of Jesus. Also, Jesus doesn't talk about using violence to destroy things that are evil. None of that is in Jesus. Well, those are things that are conveniently left out. So go back to Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson. We divide the world between evil and good. We find something that we have some kind of claim for as being good. We forget anything about proportionality, and we then justify our actions as this violence is sanctioned by God. What Kirill did is the same thing Osama bin Laden did. It's the same thing that some within the IRA did. It's the same thing that Robertson and Falwell, although they're not proposing violence, they are justifying. We're going to take ambiguous scriptures. We're going to give them a certain interpretation. So go back to the word of wisdom. We're going to give them a peculiar interpretation. We're going to ignore other things that seem to be really clear, and we're just going to ignore them, and we're going to justify them. And we're doing that to justify our worldview, our identity, our politics. We're not imposing scripture by force. We're imposing our particular worldview and using scripture to justify our use of force. Thank you.